Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hearts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today's guest is Catherine Garrett. In 2019, Catherine suffered from an amniotic fluid embolism while in labor with her second daughter. This resulted in 6 or 7 surgeries, being placed on life support, and slipping into a coma for over a week. She also had a stroke and needed ECMO to save her life. Catherine is a birth trauma survivor who made it her mission to support fellow perinatal trauma sufferers and survivors. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Lauren Rose. I feel really grateful to be here and share more about my story.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us kind of more about what happened during, while trying to have your second child or your second daughter?
Yeah, so while I was in labor, it was like hour 23, 24 of labor, something like that. Um, I had the epidural, so I was taking a nap, literally woke up from my nap, yelled, "My heart is racing," and my husband walked out of the room to go get my nurse. And by the time they came back, we think I had a seizure. That's not been confirmed. But my husband said my eyes kind of rolled back in my head. And I've gotten to reconnect with my L&D nurse. And she said, like, my hands were kind of posturing kind of strangely, so to speak. And at that point, my nurse kind of grabbed me several times, yelling my name. And then, yeah, that's when I coded the first time.
Mhm.
And so at that point, they call in, they push the staff assist button, and that calls the NICU team and the L&D team. And I don't, for your listeners who don't know, when a when the mom codes like that, they need to get the baby out within 5 to 6 minutes to not only prevent further brain damage to the baby, but it helps for CPR for the mom. It helps alleviate pressure off of your abdominal aorta. So blood is circulating a little bit easier. And so we unfortunately hit that mark before they got a pulse back. And so they did an emergency C-section. My daughter, her name is Chloe Ann, and she miraculously, I say walked away. Obviously, she wasn't walking when she was a newborn, but came out of the trauma with an incision on her right shoulder. But other than that, for all intents and purposes, is okay. She did have to be intubated and needed oxygen for about 24 hours, but made an incredible, miraculous recovery. And so obviously they get her out, hand her off to the NICU team, and then they divert their focus back, or not divert their focus. There's 2 teams, 2 dedicated teams working on each patient. But now the focus is on me as well. And so they're trying to stop the bleeding, because with an AFE, typically the first stage is hypotension, which is where your blood pressure plummets. And some moms go into cardiac arrest, like myself. Some moms don't. And then typically the second phase is you go into what's called DIC, or disseminated intervascular coagulation. And that's when the bleeding factors of your blood and the clotting factors of your blood stick together. So basically, you bleed out all of your clotting factors. So you're just profusely bleeding. And so at this point, my uterus is not contracting properly, and they're trying to stop the bleeding. They can't stop it. Meanwhile, like, they're getting my pulse back, but typically when these situations happen, you lose the pulse pretty quickly again. And so over the course of about 2 days, I coded a total of 6 times. And then, like I said, they're trying to control the bleeding. But once they got me somewhat stabilized, they packed my abdomen and rushed me to the OR. At that point, they decided to do a hysterectomy. I've since learned they didn't even ask for consent from my husband. They just did it. Yeah, it was a life-saving measure. So I'm really grateful. I mean, it's complex. I hate that I can't have any more children, but it saved my life too. So after that surgery, they got me stabilized, moved me to the ICU. And that first surgery took about 6 hours. So my daughter was born at about, I think it's either 5:15 or 5:45 in the evening. And so now it's like maybe 1:30 in the morning, the next morning. And they did more imaging and saw that I was still internally bleeding. And so they took me back to the OR again. And after that first surgery, they told my husband, like, she's stable for now, still in very critical condition, but hopefully we won't have to put her on ECMO. And from the introduction, I had to be put on ECMO. And so they couldn't stabilize my blood pressure or keep my pulse steady after that second surgery. And so ECMO is a machine that basically functions as your heart and lungs when they're not functioning themselves. So then after that second surgery, my husband asked my cardiothoracic surgeon, well, last time you said she didn't need to be on ECMO. What's the next step after this? And the surgeon obviously gets a solemn look on his face and says, unfortunately, this is all we can do for her. It's up to her and God. Like, there's nothing else we can do. And so obviously, that was, I'm sure, a very surreal moment for my family and loved ones. But I was on ECMO for about 5 days and had a few setbacks with the increase in the bleeding, etc. But I think it was like day 3 or 4, they were able to close the C-section scar, but I also had open heart surgery. And so that's where I was still bleeding from, like internally. And at this point, or over the course, so I was in a coma for a total of 9 days. And over that course, I received over 100 units of blood. And like I said, had the hysterectomy, was on ECMO, had washout surgeries, and then unfortunately had a stroke as well. And as you can imagine, recovery has been really, really long. My daughter's now 4.5. I'm currently taking a break from rehab because up until about 3 weeks ago, I was in rehab continuously for 4.5 years. So I've decided to take a small break, but my rehab team still wants me in a rehab program long term. So it's been nothing short of long and arduous, and it's hard to be a mom, it's hard to be a wife, all the things. And even in all of that, though, we're immensely grateful. I was given a 1% chance of survival, so it's just quite miraculous that I'm here today talking to you.
So that's a lot, as you know, that is a lot of stuff
Yes.
that, to be going on at the same time. How do those things affect you now? Like what are the long-term ramifications of all those issues?
So I do still struggle with fatigue is probably the biggest thing I struggle with. Um, so after my coma, unfortunately, I developed POTS, which falls under the dysautonomia umbrella. And what happens is when I stand up, my heart rate skyrockets and my blood pressure tanks. So sometimes I'll pass out. Obviously, I get dizzy, I get headaches. It's just really not a fun feeling. And fun fact, astronauts actually get this condition quite often when they go in space because there's no gravity in space. I also have, well, it's kind of hard to like really, there was so much going on. It's really hard to pinpoint what caused what. So, like, I have post stroke fatigue. I have chronic migraines now, never had a migraine before my AFE. And also, my stroke was, my right side was affected. So the stroke was on my left and it's opposite deficits. And I have weakness in my right leg. I personally think it's from the ECMO machine. I developed a clot. I think it was the day that they were about to take me off ECMO. I developed a massive clot in my abdomen and it blocked blood flow to my legs and my kidneys. And actually, by the grace of God, they moved that surgery up 4 hours early. And they obviously found that clot 4 hours sooner. And so I do have stents in my iliac arteries, and I still have atrophy to this day. I have atrophy in my right leg. So, as you can imagine, it makes it really hard to walk, do just things that a lot of people take for granted, like squatting, um, bending over to tie my kids' shoes, just like daily things that a lot of moms find very easy. Those are probably the big things that I still struggle with.
Okay, so you went in to have a baby and you came out disabled, right?
Yes.
So I know this is a complex question, but like what were some of the thoughts and feelings that that were going on with you when you were leaving the hospital and coming home?
So I was 34 when I had my second daughter. Walked into the hospital very like I practiced yoga. I had a 2-year-old at the time. I was a stay-at-home mom, so obviously very active with her. I grew up horseback riding. I started riding horses when I was 10. At one point, I was a runner and did a half marathon. So, like, just to kind of give you a picture in your mind of I was very physically fit. And honestly, that's probably one of the big reasons I'm quote unquote doing as well as I am now, because I was so physically fit and so healthy. And it took, so when I first woke up, I was extremely confused, obviously, partly from the brain injury, the stroke. And then I personally believe ICU delirium is very real. Like I couldn't read a clock, like an analog clock, and like time would pass and it just didn't really, I didn't understand, which feels so weird to say, but I didn't understand like what was happening when time was passing. I also was on a lot of pain meds. Ironically, they gave me one that we use as a horse tranquilizer. So I thought that was kind of funny when I read that in my record. But and actually reading clocks was something I struggled with for years. That was something like I had to reteach myself basically. And so just to kind of put you where I was very confused. I didn't understand a lot. My husband said it was like 50 first dates. Like he would come in and tell
Mhm.
me about the AFE, what happened. And then, like, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours later, he'd have to repeat the story all over again. And I wasn't even like connecting with family members or the nurses, etc. And when I first got home from the hospital, I very naively thought I would need to recover for 2 to 3 months and then be back to being a stay at home mom full time. That was so far from what has happened. I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe because on one hand, I'm like, I feel so sorry for that person who didn't fully grasp the severity of the situation. But at the same time, like I was young and healthy. So I thought like I would be fine. And it took 6 months for me to fully understand. I had multiple rehospitalizations that first year, but one, it was almost 6 months to the day, ironically. I was rehospitalized because I had developed fluid around my heart and in my lungs. And I looked at my cardiologist and I said, well, why did this happen? He was like, it's from your AFE. And I was like, you're kidding me. That was 6 months ago. And he was like, your body is still healing. And I'm getting a little emotional. Um, it just, it's just been, I don't want to say awful because we're grateful for how well, quote unquote, well I'm doing, but it's been unimaginable. It's been literally the hardest thing I've ever gone through or seen anyone in my circle of influence go through.
What are the most difficult parts of parenting and being a wife and a friend and a daughter and all these relationships that you have? What are the most difficult parts of all those things?
Probably the invalidation from a lot of people. They see that I am walking, talking, like probably for a year, I couldn't even like really string a sentence together. So it's quite miraculous. Like I'm talking as well as I am. I think too, they don't understand they're everyone, no matter what kind of parent, child, friend you are, has good days and bad days. But when you have these other layers, like my heart is still healing. Um, I'm still working hard in rehab, so that makes me tired. I've damage to my leg. We don't know if that'll be permanent. I really hope it's not. But that makes it hard to do a lot of things that most people do very easily. I think all of those different layers, people don't understand that my my quote unquote good day is probably your bad day. And like, I really am just trying to keep up with everyone around me. And my kids do really well. Like this weekend, we were at a dance competition and it was like about an hour away. And even being in the car, sometimes I get motion sick, which is not a great feeling. And then just the noise, like a lot of people after having a brain injury have sensitivity to light and noise. I'm so lucky to have both. Um, but so we're in the car and I have, my now 4.5 and 6.5 year old. And just the noise, I like put in my earplugs and I was like, I just need like 10 minutes of silence before we go to this event that I know is going to be loud. And like, I think I do a pretty okay job. Like, there are times I have to duck out and like go sit in the car just for silence for 15, 20 minutes or however long. And my kids just on Saturday were like, okay. And they were so good. They didn't peep a word for 10 whole minutes, which, for kids that young, like that's a big feat. And I think, but from the adults in my life, the hardest thing is the invalidation. Like I've had people say to me, you need to stop letting your disability hold you back. Um, well, why are you limping? Why do you wear a brace on your foot? It's just, and these are people who were in the hospital to visit me after I had my AFE. So these are people that know the whole story. If a little kid or a stranger on the street asks that question, that's a lot different than a family member who knows my whole story. And I try, especially if I'm using one of my accessibility devices, if I notice a child, quote unquote, staring, they're being curious. Um, I will ask them like, do you have any questions? I see that you're looking at my device. Do you want to ask a question about it? And just opening that conversation, I think, is important too. But at least the family members and the friends who know my story, I think that more compassion is needed.
I feel like I'm really lucky. I don't have that problem. Like my close family is all very understanding, so I'm really blessed in that aspect. Um, so when you had your second child, your first one was about two, right?
Correct.
So you could do a lot of things with her that you haven't been able to do with your second daughter. Like, talk about that a little bit.
That's been hard. I think one of the harder parts of my story is the impact on my husband and my girls. Um, just recently, the end of the school year is coming up, and just recently we were trying to make the decision, do we keep her home for VPK or continue sending her to daycare? And it took multiple days of praying about it, obviously talking to my husband, trusted friends, etc. But I always wanted to homeschool my kids. That was like my dream. When I decided I wanted to have kids, I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. I wanted to homeschool. And unfortunately, that has not happened. And that's hard. It's on one hand, we're really grateful because we have an amazing school. It's literally like 8 minutes from our house. And the staff really care for our children like their own. I can't speak highly enough of it. But on the other hand, it's not the plan that we had. And so, like I said, the impact on the kids and my husband is the hardest to deal with. And just realizing like we just have to play the cards we were dealt. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Like we just have to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, there's a fantastic book that I read when I was going through my grieving process of living with chronic pain. It's called It's Not Supposed to Be This Way by
Yeah.
Lisa TerKeurst. I don't know if you read
Yes.
that, but
I
she's
haven't read that one, but
fantastic.
I am familiar with Lisa TerKeurst. I love her to death. She's incredible.
I know forgiving what you can't forget is also good. But one
Mhm.
thing that I learned from It's Not Supposed to Be This Way, because that's what I was going through at the time. Like I couldn't work anymore. I'd lost a lot of functionality. I'd lost a lot of my identity. I felt like I'd lost my purpose in life. And one thing I learned from her book was that my life didn't have to be over. Like God could take my life and make something completely different and new and beautiful out of it. So that was just a really inspiring book for me.
Mhm.
For anybody else, I think, who is a person of faith and whose life is not going the way that you had laid it out for yourself.
Yeah, and just 2 days ago, I had a meeting to create a new program at our church for, we're going to call it, the name of our church is Trinity. And so we're going to call it Trinity Cares. And the acronym is going to stand for Christ always restores every soul. And our hope there is to love on the people who oftentimes feel overlooked, whether that's chronic illness or you're in foster care, you are parenting a disabled child, whatever that looks like for you, it's our hope is to really just see those people who feel unseen. And my good friend was telling me on Tuesday, or during the meeting, my good friend was telling me, she's like, God is using this story to open your eyes to the people that us as able-bodied humans often overlook. And I was like, I thank you. I- on one hand, like it's true. It's absolutely true. I see the one. I see the one sitting in the corner by themselves who, doesn't feel included. But at the same time, I told her, I was like, I would not have picked this for myself. I wouldn't have. I don't think anyone would, but that doesn't mean I can't be grateful. Um, and God can that doesn't mean I can't be grateful and God can't use my story to help others. And, you know, so I wasn't working at the time when I became disabled. So it was a little different for me, but still I considered taking care of my children my quote unquote job. I was being paid for it, but I loved it. I think one of the harder things that I deal with too is I got so much time with my first daughter, because even when she was born, I was a nanny. So I took her to work for her first year of life. And then for her second year of life, I was a stay at home mom with her. So I was with her 24/7. I took like obviously a couple girls' trips, but for the most part, I was with her 24/7. And then with Chloe, like overnight, like I can't even take care of her. I can hardly pick her up. I wasn't even allowed to walk around with her. And I had lifting restrictions. I know a lot of C-section moms do as well, but they were more worried about my chest scar, which is kind of comical because my chest scar didn't reopen, but my C-section scar did. Um, we weren't protecting that one as well, but it's healed fine now. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's one of the harder things of like, I'm never going to get that time. I'm never going to get Chloe Ann's newborn stage back. Like it's just gone. And I, again, naively thought, so I wasn't around for her newborn pictures. And I love my mother in law to death. She's incredible, but she is in some of Chloe's newborn pictures. And I'm like, that's not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And when Chloe Ann was about a year and a half old, I told my husband, I was like, I want to do family photos. Like, we haven't done them yet. And yeah, so we scheduled family photos. And I naively thought it would make me feel better that I didn't have those newborn photos, but it doesn't, because you can't ever get that back. You just have to live with what was supposed to be and is not. But God can still be good and the is not too.
Right. And another thing it can do is actually bring us closer in a relationship to him. You know, it's
Yes.
through our struggles that we often are more apt to go and talk to him and ask for help from him. And I've definitely found that in my life. I started a women's group at my church for people with chronic pain, and that's been a blessing not just to the other people but to me as well, because it makes me feel like I'm doing something good in the world, and it makes me feel
Mhm.
like I'm not alone, which has, I feel like chronic pain has been such a lonely journey for me most of my
Yes.
life. um, so you talked about migraines. Do you have any other kind of chronic pain after all of this?
Yeah, I'm thankful you brought that up because my leg hurts literally every single day.
Mhm.
And I do still horseback ride. I do therapeutic horseback riding now, so it again looks different. I mean, growing up, I competed through middle, high school, and college. So, would ride my horse like, I don't know, 3, 4 hours a day throughout the summer and like not even blink an eye. And now I can do, I don't know, 15, 20, sometimes 30 minutes. And I get off the horse and I'm limping. Like I'm just, and it's just unimaginable pain that a lot of a lot of people deal with every day. And I think the general public naively think because just because I have a smile on my face does not mean I'm not in pain. And thankfully my migraines are a little better controlled right now, but the pain in my leg like literally every day. And even like for my chest, I think it was 6 chest tubes. So I have scars. Like I actually tried to count my scars once and I stopped at 30 or 31 because I was like, that's just such a high number. I don't even think I need to know like the real number. And for our C-section mamas, like, a scar doesn't heal like, or a scar heals, but it's never like it was before that incision. And so that a lot of times causes pain and uncomfortability. And so just, you could just imagine like all over, I mean, it's like almost every extremity. It just, yeah, I'm in pain every day. And I do have a great pain management team. I do acupuncture and a procedure called OMT, similar to chiropractic care, but a little more gentle on the body. And so that helps, but it never fully goes away.
Have you found anything else that helps besides those treatments?
Actually, my this is called a neuromuscular electrical stimulation device. So it's kind of like a TENS, but it
Hmm.
stimulates the nerves a little bit more and it gets deeper into the muscle. So the hope there is it will stimulate those nerves, because nerves, whether that's like neuroplasticity in the brain or like in my leg that has atrophy, um, nerves, I believe they heal at 1 millimeter a month. So just like a really painstakingly slow process. And so the hope with this device is it stimulates it more. And so I use this device practically every day, sometimes multiple times a day. I mean, even going to church, I slap it on before I go to church because I know church, even just walking around church, is going to wear me out. And I think too, people don't under, don't understand that complexity of good days and bad days. So like sometimes I'm using my cane, but if it's a really great day, maybe I'm not using my cane. And they're like, "Well, you didn't use it the other day, so why are you using it now?" And I think people mean well when they make comments like, "Oh, look at you walking in church all by yourself. Like you're doing so great." And it's like, to me, that feels invalidating because they obviously can't see the pain I'm in. But I don't know. Sometimes it's like, today's a great day, praise the Lord. But other days it's, I do need my cane, or I have a walker too that I use sometimes. And like when we go to theme parks, we use a wheelchair because I do try to get up and walk as much as I can, but there's definitely that proverbial brick wall that I'm like, nope, I can't. Like literally my husband would be carrying me out of the theme park. So it's just something, and it stinks. Like I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It does. It stinks that that's what I need to go enjoy a day with my kids and my family. But we're doing what we got to do.
I know a lot of younger people who have to use accessibility devices have a lot of shame, and they
Yeah.
always think people are looking at them or judging them. I feel that way when I use a handicap parking spot. Like I've gotten better. Like my first year or two when I had the placard, I almost refused to use it. My husband would make me use it because I'm like, well, I don't want anybody looking at me, because besides limping when I walk, like it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just always am so afraid somebody's going to say something to me. Like what are you doing parking there? You don't need that, something like that. That's just going to invalidate me, to use your word. And I have gotten better about using it when I need to, but I still hate it. There's a lot of shame for me wrapped up in all that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because so I was in the hospital between the ICU and the step down unit for 3 weeks and then had to go to rehab for 8 days. And when I was being discharged from rehab, they were like, "Do you want to take any accessibility devices home?" And again, being prideful, not understanding what happened. I mean, I didn't even know what an AFE was at that point. I'd never heard of it. I never knew. Like, my older sister had a complication with her first delivery, but I never knew that like you could actually die during childbirth. And so, like I said, they asked me if I wanted to take some devices home. And I was like, well, no, I don't think I need it. Like, I had been walking around the the rehab hospital without devices. Now, sometimes I would use the walker, or um, they would walk behind me with the wheelchair. So if I needed to sit down, I could. And I stupidly thought because I wasn't using it all the time, I didn't need it, which is so far from the truth. And, I told my husband, like, well, first, like, I argued with him about going to rehab. So ridiculous. But like at that point, I couldn't even sit up in bed by myself. Like that was something we were working on when I went to rehab. But I told him, I was like, I wish that they would have made me take the devices home, even if they just collected dust in the corner. And it was actually 6 months later. I have a good friend who works or used to work for, it's called CIL, and they donate accessibility devices to disabled people. But I wanted to get a rollator so I could sit and cook at the stove because standing at the stove was too hard. And so that's why I first got my rollator. And like I said, it was ridiculous that I didn't come home with anything because I was so weak. And then as I started to do more and push myself more, I started falling. And I had to do balance therapy next. And I remember asking the therapist, like, do you see this a lot? And whether that's a brain injury or like trauma patients, where as they're trying to do more, they start like quote unquote new things pop up. And she was like, oh, yeah, we see it all the time. And I think like, even though I heard the words she was saying, I was almost invalidating myself of like, well, maybe I'm just like being dramatic or, being, I don't know what the word is, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say of like, I was almost invalidating myself that even though I heard the words, like I didn't actually believe them or take them to heart. And now that I'm 4.5 years out, and looking back, I'm like, yes, I totally needed balance therapy because I wasn't even connecting the dots of like how to safely catch my balance if I got off balance. And driving was another thing. I didn't get my license back for over 3 years. And I've never understood the how much you are multitasking when driving a car. And I've had family members not say it to my face, but like through a spouse, well, Kathy's driving again now. She's fine. And it's like, no, no, you don't understand. You saw me when I was in the ICU on a ventilator with like all of these machines keeping my body alive. Yet now you quote unquote think I'm fine. It's far from the truth. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, I imagine that would not only be frustrating, but hurtful as well.
It is. It is very hurtful, especially when it's family who are supposed to be the ones who are supporting you. Especially when, because I come from a military family. So I also started working at the barn where my horse was when I was 13 to pay for my horse. So like I have a very strong work ethic. That was something like I thank my parents for all the time. But I have a really, to this day, like I have a great drive. Just yesterday morning or the day before, I wrote down a new list of goals for my physical therapy and my occupational therapy. So, because I've met a lot of my goals, and even one of the goals I had to change because it was too hard of a goal. It wasn't a short term goal that has now turned into a long term goal. And I think too of like, it's hard to admit that I had to change that because it's for horseback riding. And so it's something, I did for years and years and years before I got sick. So like I said, it's hard to change that goal, but at the same time, like I think back to, I woke up, so my daughter was born September 19th. I woke up September 28th. And a couple days after they're doing they always do a physical therapy evaluation after you wake up. They're doing the evaluation. I couldn't even stand from a chair on my own. I vividly remember trying like 4 times to do it by myself, and I couldn't. My husband and my therapist had to stand me from a chair, something that seems really simple. And there are times I still get frustrated because I think too a lot of people don't understand like good days and bad days, but at the same time, like something that I could do in the morning may be hard even just a few hours later, depending on where my fatigue is, my cognitive fatigue, if I've just come home from rehab, whatever that day brought. So like there are times I get frustrated that I can't stand from a chair because unfortunately I have to tell my rehab team every time I fall,
Mm.
which is frustrating and annoying, but it's important information for them. So when I do get frustrated, I try to remind, I'm not perfect. I'm still human. But I do still try to remind myself of those days of like when I couldn't even do that at all.
So if you had like one piece of advice for people with chronic pain, chronic illness, like one thing you'd want them to know, what do you think that would be?
Grace upon grace upon grace.
Mm.
It's and it's not easy. And I want to validate your hard because our society does not do that enough. They don't. And like in your situation, when you were talking about using your handicap placard, um, it's it's really disgusting when people question it. At the same time, other people abuse it. So it's really like they'll use a family member's placard, which I've since learned is illegal. You can call the cops on them. I didn't know that. Um, but at the same time, like, there are days that maybe you don't need your handicap placard. Like it's a really great day. You're feeling great. You're not in pain, or maybe your pain's not as severe, whatever that day brought. But then the next day, maybe, I don't know, had a birthday party for your kids and you need to lie in bed the majority of the day. Like I mentioned earlier, I was at a dance competition for my daughter this weekend. And Monday and Tuesday, I hardly did anything. Like I was so exhausted and just so physically and cognitively worn out that I needed to rest for multiple days. And especially as a mom, that's not easy. Uh, Moms really want to be able to do it all for our spouses, for our kids, and it's not easy. My kids, I think, have the biggest impact because they don't fully understand. I mean, at least for my younger daughter, I actually had a good friend. Let me back up a second. So I have a good friend who I was sharing with her one day how I was sad that, I'm not able to do everything for my kids, like take them to school, cook them dinner, whatever. And, I said, Chloe Ann, this is just the life she's known. And she so eloquently said, even though Claire doesn't necessarily remember because she was 2, so she probably doesn't have vivid memories of me being a stay at home mom, she at least remembers the way that I made her feel. I would just scoop her up effortlessly and console her or, get on the floor with her and play with her. And those are things that I really struggle to do now. That's actually one of my new rehab goals, getting on the floor and getting up safely. But to answer your question, grace upon grace, and I want to validate your heart. I'm here to validate your heart.
Yeah, I know. I've had chronic pain of some sort since, before my daughter was born. So that's all she's known. But
Hmm.
it started out with migraines. And then when she was 3, I started having severe spinal pain. And then that morphed into all my joints hurting. And then that morphed into fibromyalgia. So all my muscles hurting.
Oh,
And so she's 11 now, and she's really so empathetic and loving. And I think me being in pain all the time and her seeing that, but also seeing that I really try my hardest to do things with her and do things for her, I think that's just made her really, really empathetic and loving and understanding. So I'm really grateful for that.
I agree. I'm really, as my kids get older, I'm really excited to see how God's going to write their story and how He's going to use our AFE, because it really is like, it didn't only impact me, it impacted me physically, but it still impacts them. But I'm really excited to see how God is going to use our AFE and whatever they're going to do in the future. I think that that's one of the biggest drives for me to keep going.
Yeah. So where can we find out more about you? Do you have social media? Do you have a website?
Yeah, so I have a website. Let me first start. Um, my podcast is called Birth Trauma Stories, and we're on Spotify and Apple, so you can listen there. I also have a website. It's www.birthtraumastories.com. And then social media, I'm on Instagram, Threads, YouTube, and Facebook. All birth trauma stories.
You know,
I tried to
that's,
keep it easier
I
to
know.
remember, hopefully.
That's what I did with mine. Like Edit hurts to mom everywhere. So I'm really easy to find.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on.
You're so welcome, Lauren Rose. Thank you for your time and thank you for allowing me to share my story on your platform.
It was really interesting. I mean, terrible, but really interesting.
Yeah. That's I think you hit the nail on the head.
Make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any health, parenting, or life advice. For my freebie 30 ways to relieve pain without taking a pill, go to ithurtstomom.com/tips. If you have comments, suggestions, or want to be on this podcast, email me at ithurtstomom@gmail.com. I wish everybody a blessed and pain-free day.